Imagine this. You wake up one morning, pull back the curtains, and see the river that flows through your city all year long completely frozen over. Not just a thin layer of ice, but thick, solid ice. Ice so strong it can hold a bustling market, horses walking across it, carts rolling, hundreds of people gathering on it. And this is not a story from a fairy tale. This was a normal January in the 17th century London. The Thames River would freeze over, sometimes for weeks. And when it did, Londoners would turn it into a festival. They called them frost fairs. They roasted whole bulls right on the ice. People played games, shopped at stalls, and drank beer in tents set up in the middle of a frozen river in the heart of the city. It sounds almost magical, doesn't it? But here's the dark side. The same bitter cold that made these celebrations possible also brought misery. It killed millions of people. It toppled empires, it sparked wars, and some historians even believe it helped fuel the witch hunts. This is the story of the Little Ice Age, one of the most dramatic and consequential climate events in human history, yet a story that almost nobody talks about. Hi, great to see you, or if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found this video. Today we're diving into the Little Ice Age, and I want to be clear from the start. This is not a video about climate change. That's not where we're going today. This is a video about history, about science, about how people even managed to survive, because the Little Ice Age was one of the most dramatic periods in European history. So, let's break it down. What exactly was the Little Ice Age? In short, it was a long period of cooling that affected much of the world, but hit Europe especially hard, roughly from the 1300s to the mid-1800s. About 500 years of significantly colder climate compared to what came before and after. Not an ice age in the sense of dinosaurs going extinct, more like a prolonged cold spell stretching across a half a millennium. First, let's take a look at the causes. Scientists have been debating the exact causes for decades, and the current consensus is that, most likely, several factors lined up at the same time to create this prolonged cold. Factor number 1, volcanoes. During the 1200s and early 1300s, the world saw a series of massive volcanic eruptions. When a large volcano erupts, it doesn't just devastate the surrounding area, it shoots huge amounts of sulfur dioxide high up into the stratosphere. There, the sulfur forms a kind of aerosol veil that spreads around the globe and reflects sunlight away from the Earth. With less sunlight reaching the surface, temperatures drop, sometimes significantly for months or even years after the eruption. The most striking example is the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815, which occurred near the very end of the Little Ice Age. This single eruption caused what became known as the Year Without a Summer. The following year in New England, snow actually fell in June. Crops failed across much of the northern hemisphere, leading to widespread famine. People went hungry, and entire communities struggled to survive. But the story doesn't start there. Earlier eruptions, including one in the mid-1200s, traces of which scientists have found in ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, may have set off this long chain of cooling. These volcanic events combined over decades and centuries to slowly change the climate, creating the unusually cold conditions that defined the Little Ice Age. Factor number 2, the sun went quiet. In the 17th century, astronomers noticed something strange. Sunspots, those dark areas on the sun that indicate its activity, almost completely disappeared. From around 1645 to 1715, there was a period now known as the Maunder Minimum. Almost no sunspots appeared, and less solar activity means slightly less energy reaches the Earth. On its own, the effect was small, barely noticeable, but combined with everything else, like volcanic eruptions and other factors, it became significant. Factor number 3, ocean circulation changed. In the Atlantic Ocean, there's a massive system of currents, and one of the most important is the Gulf Stream. It carries warm tropical water across the ocean to Europe, which is why the climate in Western Europe is so much milder than in other regions at the same latitude, like Canada. During the Little Ice Age, this circulation seems to have weakened significantly. Scientists think this may have been caused by melting Arctic ice, which poured large amounts of cold, fresh water into the ocean. This disrupted the salty balance that drives the currents and slows down the movement of warm water toward Europe. With less warm water reaching the continent, the winters became much colder, and summers shorter and less predictable. Crops struggled to grow, rivers froze more often, and communities faced harsher living conditions than they had for generations. So volcanoes, a quiet sun, and weakened ocean currents all came together, overlapping and reinforcing each other over several centuries. The result? Europe froze, and not just a little colder than usual. It truly froze in a way people had never experienced before. Now imagine yourself as a peasant in France, Germany, or England in the late 17th century. From a scientific point of view, the Little Ice Age did not look like an apocalypse. On average, temperatures in Europe dropped by about half a degree to 1 degree compared to the medieval warm period. That doesn't sound very dramatic. Half a degree, maybe 1 degree. Today, you probably wouldn't even notice the difference in your daily life. But for pre-industrial agriculture, this was a massive udar, a serious and devastating blow. Why? Because we are not talking about a slightly cooler and more comfortable climate. We're talking about a shift in entire climate boundaries. If the average temperature drops even by half a degree, it means more late spring frosts, nights when young crops can suddenly freeze and die. It also means earlier cold in the fall, cutting the growing season short. A shorter growing season by several weeks. Colder and wetter summers that slow down plant growth. More frequent heavy rains during harvest time when crops are most vulnerable. And grains, especially wheat, are extremely sensitive to these kinds of changes. Even small shifts can have serious consequences. The growing season, the number of frost-free days, could shrink by 2, 3, sometimes even 4 weeks. For a modern farmer, that would be a serious inconvenience. But for a 17th century peasant, it was a matter of survival. Now add to this the complete lack of modern tools and support. No fertilizers, no greenhouses, no crop breeding in the modern sense, no irrigation systems, no insurance to fall back on. If your harvest failed, there was no supermarket to rely on, no government food aid, no global grain trade on the scale we have today. There was only your small piece of land and whatever it could produce. Now imagine this. A frost in spring right after sowing, a cold, wet summer with rain and grain rotting in the fields, then an early frost in the fall. 1 bad season means failure. 2 in a row means debt. 3 means hunger. Your entire life depends on agriculture, food, income, survival, and the cold makes all of it unstable. Harvest became dangerously unpredictable. The 1690s were especially brutal. The winter of 1693 to 1694 in France was so severe that around 1.5 million people died from hunger and cold, within just a few years, in a single country. In Finland, between 1695 and 1697, about a third of the population died. In Scotland, 7 years of failed harvest from 1695 to 1702 wiped out roughly 15% of the population. How did people cope with all of this? How did they survive in a world that kept getting colder and more unpredictable? Some adaptations were purely practical. People could not change the climate, but they could change their behavior and the way they worked the land. First of all, the crops themselves began to change. Farmers gradually shifted toward more resilient and faster maturing grains. If summers became shorter, they needed crops that could ripen more quickly. If spring frosts became more commons, they needed varieties that could survive colder soil and harsher conditions. In many regions, wheat was increasingly replaced by rye. Rye requires less warmth and can tolerate poor, wet soils much better. The bread made from it is darker and rougher, but it is far more reliable. And in an unstable climate, reliability matters far more than taste. The use of oats and barley also expanded, especially in colder and more marginal areas. And where grain harvests kept failing, people turned more and more to root crops like turnips and rutabagas and later potatoes. Anything that could grow in a cool and damp environment became a crucial and strategic resource for survival. Second, storage methods improved. Cellars became deeper and better insulated, helping to protect food from freezing and moisture. Barns were built with proper ventilation so that grain would not rot or grow mold in damp conditions. Food supplies were managed more carefully, with part of the harvest kept as seed for the next season, and parts stored as a strategic reserve for hard times. There was also much more focus on drying, smoking, and salting food. This was not about cuisine or taste. It was a survival technology. If summers were short and unpredictable, people needed reliable ways to preserve calories for the long winter months. Wealthier households and Torgovi centers gradually adapted their diets as well. In Northern Europe, the consumption of salted fish increased significantly, especially herring. Fish was less dependent on unstable weather on land. The sea was cold, but it remained a steady and reliable source of protein. The Dutch became true masters of herring preservation. Their fishing fleets and trade networks allowed them to store and transport fish for months at a time. In a way, this acted as a form of insurance against failed grain harvests. If there was less bread, fish helped fill the gap. At the same time, international grain trade began to grow, especially in cities. Dutch and Baltic merchants actively transported grain between regions. If crops failed in one place, it could be brought in from another. This became an early mechanism for smoothing out climate shocks and reducing the risk of total famine. But it's important to understand that none of these measures made life comfortable. They only reduced the chances of complete disaster. Diets became more monotonous, bread grew darker and coarser, there were more porridges and fewer wheat-baked goods, more salted and pickled food, and far less fresh produce. This was a time when taste gradually gave way to survival. It was during this period that European states began actively promoting a new crop, the potato. It had been brought from South America in the 16th century as part of the Columbian Exchange, but for a long time Europeans were suspicious of it. The potato was considered a non-biblical plant, and in some regions it was even seen as dangerous. In certain areas it was grown as an ornamental plant rather than as food. But when grains began to fail on a large scale due to cold, wet summers, when wheat rotted in the fields and rye froze in the winter, the potato proved surprisingly resilient. It could grow in poorer soils, withstand damp conditions, and provide a high yield of calories from a small patch of land. In the 18th century, the governments of France, Prussia, and other countries literally forced peasants to plant potatoes. In Prussia, Frederick II even went so far as to order soldiers to guard potato fields. The idea was to make the crop seem valuable, encouraging people to steal it, and in doing so, help spread its cultivation across the land. The mass adoption of the potato did not happen overnight. It took time, effort, and a lot of persuasion. But gradually it became Europe's insurance policy against a repeat of the catastrophic famines of the 17th century. And yes, every time you eat mashed potatoes, roasted potatoes, or French fries, you're benefiting from one of the key strategies Europe developed to survive centuries of cold and unpredictable harvests. In addition, architecture began to change in response to the cold. Rooms became smaller, ceilings lower, and walls much thicker. If you look closely at historic buildings in Northern Europe, you can see a clear shift toward houses designed not for light or spaciousness, but for retaining as much heat as possible during the long, harsh winters. Surviving in such a harsh climate was only possible through cooperation. Neighbors shared resources, labor, and food supplies. Studies show that practices like collective farming and communal use of land grew stronger during the coldest periods, helping communities endure when individual households might have failed. But at the same time, stress and scarcity could push people to turn against each other. Competition over limited resources sometimes sparked conflict, tension, and even violence. We'll explore this side of life during the Little Ice Age. Even the paintings of artists from that time became full of snow, ice, and the heavy gray skies of winter. Frozen rivers, thick ice on canals, and low, heavy clouds over towns created a stark and cold atmosphere. Art historians call this the winter landscape, a genre that barely existed before the Little Ice Age. In the 1560s and 1600s, Dutch and Flemish painters became fascinated with snow and ice. Snow-covered streets and canals, rivers froze, and people struggled with the cold every day. The artists were simply capturing the reality that they saw outside their windows, the harsh conditions that shaped daily life. Even the image of a traditional Christmas, with snow on the ground, people gathered by the fire, sleighs gliding through town, and mugs of mulled wine, comes largely from the Little Ice Age. In Northern Europe, Christmas celebrations during the coldest centuries took place in snow year after year, without fail. The culture of warmth, fire, and togetherness grew out of a world shaped by real, life-threatening cold. Much of the cozy, festive imagery we now associate with Christmas was born from the struggle for survival in harsh winter conditions. Historians have a term for this period, the general crisis of the 17th century. Roughly between the 1620s and the 1680s, almost simultaneously in different parts of Europe and Asia, civil wars, uprisings, and state crises broke out. The English Civil War, the Fronde in France, the 30 Years' War in Central Europe. For a long time, these events were explained purely by politics, religion, and elite power struggles, and these were indeed important factors, but increasingly researchers are adding another layer, climate stress. In the 1690s, Europe was hit by a wave of crop failures and famine. In France, around 1.5 million people died. In Finland, up to a third of the population perished. Take the 30 Years' War. In some regions of the Holy Roman Empire, the population dropped by 20 to 30%. Some of that was due to the fighting. Some came from epidemics and famines sweeping across lands devastated by armies. The war amplified the crisis fed the war. It was a vicious cycle. The peak of witch hunts in Europe occurred at the end of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th century. This coincided with some of the coldest phases of the Little Ice Age. Imagine an ordinary person living in the early 17th century. His children are dying from hunger. The harvest has rotted again under cold, rainy skies. June arrives, and it is still bitterly cold. Winter seems endless, and every year brings the same struggle. He knows nothing about volcanoes erupting in Indonesia. He has no idea about solar minimums or changes in ocean currents, and so he begins to believe that someone has cursed him. Someone must be responsible, and they need to be found and punished. A study published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives found a statistically significant correlation between lower temperatures and the number of witch trials across different regions of Europe. The colder the year, the more accusations arose. Over 2.5 centuries of European witch hunts, up to 100,000 people were executed, most of them women. This does not mean that the climate created the witch hunts, but in a world of hunger, fear, and social instability, it amplified their scale and intensity, making communities more desperate and suspicion more deadly. The Little Ice Age is a story about how sensitive human societies are to what might seem like small changes in climate. A drop of just 1 degree in average temperature may not look catastrophic on paper, but in a world where everything depended on the harvest, it meant famine, migration, wars, and fear. If you have watched this far, thank you for being here. See you next time